Good morning. My name's Tim Snyder, and I'm a historian here at the Edison and Ford Winter Estates. And I'm going to do the digital discussion. I call it the Fort Myers Connection and the Edison's influence on the history of Fort Myers. And here we go, the Fort Myers Connection. Now, it's no coincidence that the town of Fort Myers and the Edison's history kind of begin at the same time. While there were people living here in Fort Myers, I think it's important to touch upon the history of Fort Myers first. And it was a town that was born of a fort, if you will. In 1850, the United States government built a fort right where downtown Fort Myers is currently located. It was part of the Seminole Wars. Of course, by that time, there wasn't a whole lot of fighting going on. They were basically paying Native Americans to leave the area. Here's a map of the original fort. So they would convince natives to receive financing to leave the area. Eventually, they would be relocated up in Oklahoma, and they were pretty much taken from the wharf right there, loaded on schooners, and transported up through the Gulf of Mexico. So that's what the original fort was built for. There's another picture of an 1858 blockhouse that was located at the fort. Now, during the Civil War, Fort Myers was used as a base for the Union Army, and basically to stop the cattle drives through the area that were providing beef to the Confederate States of America. I've also read that there were salt mines along the Peace River and the Caloosahatchee River, and they were also here to destroy those salt mines, which provided preservatives for the food that the Confederate Army was using. So it was abandoned in June of 1865, several months after the war ended. And that's when this man, Captain Gonzalez, shows up February 21st, 1866. He brought his friend, Joseph D. Vivas, a few family members with him, and they thought that this would be a perfect spot to raise their families. It was a quiet area. He had been delivering the mail here by schooner. That's why he is called Captain Gonzalez. He was captain of his small schooner. He delivered the mail weekly to the area before the Civil War, and he decided this would be a great place to bring his family. So they actually occupy the officers' quarters and start a little village, if you will. And of course, Punta Rassa is where the Union Army had a telegraph station that they constructed. And it was also the place where the local cattlemen would ship their herds to Cuba. And you can see on there, it says during that decade of the 1870s, over 165,000 head of cattle were shipped to Cuban ports from Punta Rassa. So it was a pretty big industry at the time. Punta Rassa here on the map is located right before you go over the Sanibel Bridge. It's about 10 miles away from the estates. We're up here, the town of Fort Myers. 10 miles down the Caloosahatchee River is the peninsula of Punta Rassa. Today, there's a Marriott Harbor Resort located on that peninsula, and that is where the Tarpon House was located. This is where Thomas Edison arrived in the area for the first time on March 15th. He was with his best friend, Ezra Gilliland. They were looking for a place to build a winter residency. They had tried North St. Augustine in particular. It was pretty cold that year, so they decided that they would head further south, and they landed here on March 15th, 1885. And there's what the Tarpon House looked like. It was a telegraph station converted into an 11-room hotel. It's also where they shipped the cattle off to Cuba. So when Thomas arrived there, He found it very romantic, if you will. He loved to watch the fishermen. There was fishermen that frequently went there. That's where it got the name Tarpon House from. And one of those days he decided to head upriver to Fort Myers. He put $100 down on 13 acres along the Caloosahatchee River. Now, he was supposed to pay $3,000 for the 13 acres, but later the price was settled at $2,750. And as soon as he purchased the property, he left town and headed back north, and he had big plans for his property from the start. Now, here's a look at the rebuilt Tarpon House. The Tarpon House burned down in 1906. Fred Schultz, the manager, got a bunch of investors, local investors together. Thomas Edison was one of those investors, and they rebuilt the Tarpon House into a more luxurious hotel. There's a picture of it around 1910. So this is what the Tarpon House ended up looking like before it eventually burned down altogether. Now, if you were wondering what Fort Myers looked like in 1885, I have some pictures here. This is an 1886 photo of Mr. Blunt's store, his general store at First and Henry. And that was George Schultz, the manager of the Tarpon House. And of course, when Thomas Edison arrived here, I did some digging and I found the article in the newspaper. Now, it wasn't front page news. I felt like I would find it on the front page of the news press, but I found it under local issues. So this was the little write-up in the newspaper. Edison is to have the Summerlin Place just off at the bend of the river, about 1 mile from the business center of Fort Myers. So this is the recorded version in the local news press. He bought 13 acres of property. You see no mention of Ezra Gilliland in this article. So already we see that it's more about Thomas Edison than his friend Ezra. Of course, they arrived and they built 2 homes, Thomas and Ezra Gilliland, one for Thomas, one for Ezra. And here's a little newspaper account. 1 year after he bought the property, he arrives with his new bride, Mina Edison. She's 20 years old. You get a look at what their original home looked like there, top left-hand corner. A little bit different than what they look like now. Now, when they came, it says in the newspaper, they were accompanied by other parties, and they stayed at the Hotel Keystone until their house was ready for them. So they didn't just come down into their home. The homes were actually prefabricated by the Kennebec Framing Company in Fairfield, Maine. All the parts were shipped down. I believe 7 boats in all arrived here on the property in January of 1886. And the Edisons actually arrived in town on March 15th that year. And they were able to stay in their new home for a few weeks before they went back up north. There's another look at one of the original homes here on the property. This was the guest house, we call it today. This was the Gilliland home. This photograph's from about 1890. Okay, so at the same time the Edison estate was being established, the town of Fort Myers was also being established. On August 12th, 1885, they held a town meeting and they unanimously voted to incorporate as a town. Now, I don't know how much influence Thomas Edison's arrival had on this decision, but the people of Fort Myers now recognize that they had a desirable area. Someone like Thomas Edison was willing to buy property here. I'm sure they felt like they could make some more money off other Northerners coming down here. There's a map. This is from the October 24th issue of the Fort Myers News Press. So there's a map of the original incorporated Fort Myers. And this would appear for the next couple of years on the front page of the news press. One of their motivations was to sell property here locally and expand as a town. Of course, they were part of Monroe County in 1885. Key West was the county seat at the time, so there was no hospital here, no medical care to speak of. If you had a medical condition, you would have to be shipped to Key West or Tampa to receive medical care, severe or serious medical care. Now, this is before Edison arrived at Fort Myers, so that it's being printed up in the newspaper. So the people of Fort Myers understand that this world famous inventor is coming to their town. They wanted to throw him a reception for his honeymoon arrival, but he said, no, thank you, just build me a road instead. He wanted to have the avenue from town to his property 60-foot wide and giving him better access to the town. So that's something that the town agreed to do for Thomas Edison. So already they're trying to court Thomas Edison here locally. And of course, after they got married on February 24th, they arrived on March 15th and stayed till April 26th. And you can see the day they arrived was recorded in the newspaper. They came on the Manatee, that's a little schooner, and they immediately went to the Hotel Keystone. So that's another picture of that. Now, a year later, Edison introduces the local people to electricity from his laboratory. There's a picture of the first laboratory that he built here in Fort Myers. He housed 2 dynamo generators in there, and many of the local people wandered down to the property to witness Thomas Edison light this place up. He flipped the switch, all the lights went on in the 2 homes at the caretaker house and the laboratory. And of course, it created a local buzz. This was the first electricity in the area. Thomas also wanted to help power up the town. He actually shipped the generator down for the town to use and encouraged them to buy some wiring and some light fixtures. And he said, I'll come back next year and light up your town for you. But the Edisons never made it back the next year. The Edisons didn't make it back for another 12 years. They had other issues to attend to up in New Jersey, like their new mansion and their new industrial complex. But while they were absent, the town continues to grow. You see, they had their first town band here. You can't be a town without a band, and Fort Myers had one. There you go. You get a picture of the original Fort Myers band. Now, it was pregnancy, iron ore mining, and other pressing matters that kept the Edisons absent. And of course, the people in Fort Myers still went without electricity. Even though Edison's property had electric, the town itself went without electric. There's Phoenix Hall. It was built in 1890, and this is where most of the political meetings, town rallies, and other activities. It was a lodge, and it was one of the centerpieces of civic society in Fort Myers. There's a look at the Patio de Leon. That's what we would know this as today. Of course, if you have a band, you got to have a bandstand, and there it is in downtown Fort Myers. This was built in the 1890s, 2nd and Lee Street. So you can see, even though they called them streets, there was no paved roads in Fort Myers. So it's a very primitive area. There's a look at the 1890 schoolhouse in Fort Myers. This was the second schoolhouse in the area. The first one burned down 3 years earlier in 1887. So they did want to educate their children here locally. And this led to Lee County being formed. Actually, the schoolhouse burning down is what motivated the people. They asked the county commissioners down in Key West to build them a new schoolhouse. They refused, so that motivated them to form Lee County. And they applied to incorporate Lee County, and the state legislature granted them that in 1887. Some more look at primitive Fort Myers. No paved roads around here. This was an 1892 photograph. So imagine when 20-year-old Mina Miller shows up in Fort Myers from a very well-educated and wealthy Ohio family. The Millers would not be surprised to see that their daughter was shocked when she got to Fort Myers. So it took her a while to fall in love with it. There's a look at the first luxury hotel. The 1898 grand opening of the Fort Myers Hotel marks the first electricity in downtown Fort Myers. Albertus Gardner provided the power from his canning company to light up the Fort Myers Hotel. Later, it became known as the Royal Palm Hotel. And this is where the first electricity was seen in downtown Fort Myers. So now things are starting to progress while the Edisons aren't here. I put a color photo of the Royal Palm Hotel. So it was very luxurious piece of property. You can see the lush plant life that was planted around the hotel there. So this was a new attraction to try to attract more people. Hugh O'Neill, Manhattan department store owner, actually financed this project. He wanted to give an alternative to the luxury hotel in Punta Gorda, if you will. Okay, they also built a courthouse while the Edisons were away. So once Lee County is formed, they know they needed a courthouse. There's a picture of the first courthouse in Lee County. Now, while the Edison was away, something else happened down here. The Gilliland home was sold to the McGregors. Thomas and his good friend Ezra had a little business falling out, and they were no longer speaking. So Thomas Edison cut Ezra Gilliland out of the history of Fort Myers altogether. The only way the world famous electrician could do it, he cut off all the electric to the Gilliland home. He cut off their water supply, and he cut their access to the pier on the property off. So the Gillilands get the message that they're unwelcome here in Fort Myers. So they sell their home to the McGregors, and this has a huge impact on Fort Myers. The McGregors buying the Edison guest home, they contributed by purchasing 32 properties in the area, more than $150,000 they invested in the local economy. And they also would go on to finance of more than one building being built in downtown Fort Myers. The McGregors make a huge impact on the modernization of Fort Myers. And if you wondered, like I did a long time ago, why isn't there Edison Boulevard going through the Edison property? It's because the McGregors also made major contributions here locally, including contributing to the road being paved through the Edison estate. So there's the McGregors. Ambrose was the president and CEO of Standard Oil. So they were very wealthy, and they contributed to Fort Myers. They actually lived on the property as winter residents, just like the Edisons. They came down here in the winter, and they would eventually sell that home in 1902. But really, what happens in the 19s, the Edisons buy the guest home. They start coming back here in 1901, and they make their presence known here locally. Fort Myers loves Edison. You can see, you start to see this in the paper printed. The Edison's arrival would often be printed ahead of time. They would be greeted at the train station by hundreds of people. and usually there would be some kind of reception thrown for the Edisons when they arrived. You can see here, I found this 1912 newspaper article that shows the Edisons are coming, and they're very excited here because they're bringing their daughter Madeline and 3 of her friends. So this also follows the 1910 grand reception that they threw for Thomas Edison on the town's 25th anniversary. He was the guest of honor, and they threw that party down at the Royal Palm Hotel. The Edisons also began to open their property up for public use. When they're here, they would often let people on the property to tour the laboratory, view the botanical gardens. Mina would become more involved with the community here in the 19s. You can see Thomas Edison's famous quote, and this would remain on the front page of the Fort Myers Press for many years. There is only one Fort Myers, and 90 million people are going to find it out. So Thomas Edison shows some pride in the local area himself. He was very happy. He called Fort Myers his jungle paradise. In March 11th, 1914, they had Edison Night at the Grand Theater, and they presented this special night of the Thomas Edison to the world. They owe him for his motion picture idea. So the Grand Theater was a theater opened up to show not only movies, but they had plays there also. So this was it was the second theater actually in town, but they opened this up in honor of Thomas Edison. And you can see every time Edison's in the newspaper here, starts to appear more and more. This was right up about Edison Week, October 16th through 21st. So this was celebrated all across the nation, and Fort Myers was in on it because they love Thomas Edison, and they see a way for the town to make some money off of the famous inventor. 1914, page 1 on the news press. It's about the city getting good advertising. They noticed that when Edison's up north, he's mentioning Fort Myers. He's getting write-ups in papers all around the place. So the Tribune, Tampa Tribune, even up in Tampa, they're seeing the benefit from Edison's view. There's a look at the Bradford Hotel where the Arcade Theater is located. That was the building that the McGregors contributed to. Tootie McGregor in particular wanted it named after her son Bradford, and that's the modern day view of it. You can still see this down on First Street. So a little contribution. Now, Thomas Edison and Henry Ford attended the Arcade Theater to watch some plays. And if you go down there, you'll see a little write-up they have about where the famous inventor and automobile manufacturer saw the play at. We have a look at the Edison Pier. This was the longest pier in the area. It became famous. Of course, the famous story of President-elect Hoover getting onto the Edison Pier. This is where he celebrated Thomas Edison's 1929 birthday. He dined here with the Edisons. He was accompanied by Thomas, and they had a grand parade in town, and that became a ongoing tradition after 1929, Fort Myers having parades on Edison's birthday. And we know that President Hoover was there for the 1929 parade. Interesting side note, 1928, they held a huge birthday party for Thomas Edison down at the Pleasure Pier, downtown Fort Myers. It was an all-day affair. Edison sat and watched over 4,000 students perform for him during the course of that day. So Edison's birthday celebration starts to become a tradition here in the 1920s. Picture of the people fishing off the Edison Pier. Of course, the local businesses would also cash in on the Edison fame. That's okay, because Thomas was friends with Captain Mensch, and he named his main steamboat after the famous scientist, the Thomas A. Edison. This was a steamliner that the Mensch brothers ran. They gave people tours up and down the beautiful Caloosahatchee River with their Thomas A. Edison. So they're very proud of this. The county builds a courthouse in 1915. Now, there's a little story behind this, because the people wanted to keep the wooden courthouse. They didn't want a modern brick courthouse. But Mr. Tolles had other ideas, and when they went up to get an injunction against wasting money on a beautiful brick courthouse, Mr. Tolles had his men rip it down before they could get back to town. And I bring that story up because as you look at some of the founding fathers, this was a 1912 picture of the Hendrys and Mr. Blunt, some of the town leaders of Fort Myers. There's a look at the Fort Myers Yacht and Country Club. Edison was a member here. He paid over $100 to get this thing rolling, and you can see later on that was closed down because no one could get to it through the sandy roads. And that's Terry Park today. So that's where Terry Park is located today. Now there's the hospital. What do you do with all the lumber when you tear down a wooden courthouse? Well, you give your people a hospital. That should make them happy. And there's a picture of the first hospital here in Lee County. It was opened in 1916 at the corner of Victoria and Grand Avenue. The laborers donated part of their wages and new materials. So this is what they salvaged out of the old courthouse. Okay, so things progress here in Fort Myers. Thomas Edison and Mina show a huge interest in the town of Fort Myers. They start to open their property up for people to enjoy it. They had high school graduations during the 1920s here in Fort Myers. They would often let local schools do field trips during their stay here in the winters. And of course, the town itself starts to modernize. They build the first wooden drawbridge connecting Fort Myers to the island, Estero Island. We call it Fort Myers Beach, and it costs you 51 cents to cross this bridge. Pretty expensive in 1921. Eventually, in 1924, you get your first automobile bridge crossing the Caloosahatchee River. This was in coordination with the construction of the Tamiami Trail. So they needed a bridge to, of course, to get Route 41 across the river. And in 1924, we got a 16-foot wide bridge that spanned the mile-plus river, and doesn't look too safe to me, but people successfully drove their cars over this bridge. A look at the Edison estate. It was very lush and green. You can see the royal palms that Thomas Edison planted along his property here, which we keep that tradition going today. If you come to the museum, you'll see the royal palms lined up. And here's a picture of Main and Henry Streets, Fort Myers. So you can see during the 1920s, the town begins to blossom. The Ritz Theater in the Patio de Leon in the mid-20s. The two buildings that you see in this photograph are still there today. So when you go down to Patio de Leon, have some food at the downtown House of Pizza. Out their back door, this is the Patio de Leon. And Fort Myers also gets their own commercial airline at Page Field in 1937. There's a picture of the crew, the National Airlines crew. This airline unfortunately had to close after 1 year because they weren't taking into account the muddied runways from the torrential summer downpours. So they ended up having to close down Page Field to commercial flights. There's a look at the 1929 graduating class of Fort Myers High School at the Edison home. So this was some of the civic activities that the Edisons began to get involved in. Now, in 1931 was a big day in Fort Myers history for more than one reason. February 11th was Thomas Edison's final birthday, and he celebrated it right here in Fort Myers. He was greeted at the gate here on the property and paraded downtown. Thousands of people attended. You get a picture of Thomas Edison in his car, and they were headed downtown and you see the young high school girls that escorted him, and the destination was at the first concrete automobile bridge downtown Fort Myers. This is where Edison untied the ribbon, and thousands of people attended. The governor of the state attended, and Fort Myers now has a real concrete automobile bridge across the river. They were all invited back to the estates for a free birthday cake if they desired. So this is the beginning of a tradition that we still carry on today. There's a look at the birthday cake, one of the birthday cakes that was prepared for Thomas Edison's birthday party. You can see a pretty big cake there. They were planning on giving out a lot of cake that day. Now, Edison's fame becomes legend on this day, I might say, because it leads to the Edison Festival of Lights. And this started in 1938 officially, even though they had been having parades for Thomas Edison's birthday as early as 1925 here. The 1929 parade was the second largest ever until 1939 when their parade broke that record. So the Edison Festival of Lights today is kind of like a 2-week celebration here. We have 2 parades, a junior parade, as well as a grand parade. The successful 3-day event grew and later increased into a 2-week-long festival. So the Edison Festival of Lights is a tradition that was started with Thomas Edison's birthday in 1931. And there's a look at the local Ford dealership. I kind of threw that in there so you can get an idea of what Fort Myers looked like downtown. There's the 1950 Lee Memorial Hospital, replacing the old wooden one. And we also have a look at the first post office. In the 1930s, after Thomas Edison died, the town continues to grow, and Mina's involvement really starts to blossom here in Fort Myers. She becomes a civic leader here in town. This is a look at the first post office. Well, not the first post office, the Grand Federal Post Office, if you will, 23,000 square foot. It's still standing today. It's now the Burn Davis Art Center on First Street, downtown Fort Myers. It was also a federal courthouse for a while. And there's a look at it in the 40s. And you'll recognize that building when you go downtown. And here's a look at the 17-teacher schoolhouse. So the 1930s are ushering in a new modern era here in Fort Myers. There's a picture of the early 40s of the downtown Fort Myers Pier. And of course, the Buckingham Army Airfield out in Lehigh, we would call it today, was a training center for the Army Air Corps. They trained machine gunners out there. They would tow them behind cars. Mina actually goes out there, lunches with the Army Air Corps, and contributes to the cause by inviting them all back to the estate here and enjoy the swimming pool when they have time off. Were welcome here on the estate. Mina would provide refreshments and let them use the Edison swimming pool. Here's the Page Field, also used during World War II. You see there's some recreation activities going on in between drills there. So Fort Myers becomes a place for the Army Air Corps to train. And Mina, she upholds the Edison tradition through the 30s. She was, just to mention a few things, Mina, since it is Women's History Month, we definitely can thank Mina for the Edison legacy and the improvement of Fort Myers. She had a huge hand in that. She was president of the Botanical Guild. She was one of the original members of the Women's Community Club here, and she also started the civic organization known as the Round Table. That was in the 20s, and she was a huge supporter of the garden tour. These were little parades and tours around town. They stopped by different estates, and they usually culminated right here at the Edison estate. Mina would greet the people on the tour and give her own personal tour of her own beautiful estates here. She loved the botanical lifestyle and had very luxurious botanical gardens here. And she led by action. She also put her money behind her commitment. Here is an article written about Mina donating $100 to the Chamber of Commerce. They were driving to get people to invest in Fort Myers, and Mina was totally on board. This was a newspaper article written up. Her and her husband would contribute to the local chamber. Mrs. Edison, of course, left in 1940, and the article was she urged for a more beautiful city. So she was trying to motivate the people of Fort Myers to beautify the area. She saw the vision of Fort Myers of more than just a cattle stop off as when she first arrived here. Her vision included things like libraries, higher education. She wanted to donate her property here for a library, also for a community college. Both of those projects never were completed here. During the 1940s, it was always big news when Mina was here in town. You can see there her plans for a new library. The city actually signed an agreement with her to build the library here on the property, but those plans fell through, mainly due to World War II. And you can see that when she was coming, it was in the paper. So people looked forward to Mina returning to Fort Myers every winter. And unfortunately, Mina did die in 1947. And of course, the Fort Myers News Press would make that big news. The city grieved Mina's death. And this is just after Mina had donated her property to the city of Fort Myers. And there's a look at Mina giving parties for soldiers. I found that in the news press. And this is some of the things Mina was honored for here in Fort Myers. And of course, her lasting legacy is she gave the city her property on February 18th, 1947, and 2 days afterward, it was written up in the paper. The city called this their most valued piece of property. So they were very happy to get this, and they took it on as a badge of honor, if you will. They wanted to be a shrine to the inventor. They also wanted it to be the beautiful botanical gardens that Mina wished it to be, where she often gave tours of her gardens. So the city gets the Edison place. The city now, by 1947, has their annual Edison Festival of Lights, and Fort Myers has totally embraced the Edison legacy here. And there's Mayor Dave Shepard saying this is the greatest physical asset that the city has, and in years to come will be our proudest and most cherished possession. So the Edison estate is a reminder for the local people here, and there are a lot of local people that were born and raised here of their past, and we're very proud to be the caretakers of the Edison and Ford Winter Estates, because this is some of the only remaining history from the 19th century in this area. And we're very happy to report that our intention is to keep this the greatest physical asset locally. And I'm really happy that you joined in for this. There's where I got my sources. So if you have any more questions, you can contact us here at the estates. So that's just a brief tidbit of what the Edisons meant. Thanks for joining in today.